Connor, for those of you who don't know him, he's a PhD student at Concordia University. And I am Lucile. I was a PhD student at DTU, and I'm working as an indoor climate specialist in the private company VELUX. So this is the Subtask 4 seminar, and for those of you who are maybe not too familiar with Subtask 4 or who need a reminder, we aim at developing and demonstrating occupant-centric building controls, which we call OCCs, and I guess you'll hear the OCC acronym a few times during this debate, so better to remember it. And the way the demonstration part of that is done is usually through case studies. And OCCs are defined as control strategies that take as inputs occupants' preferences, their habits, their schedules, and that aim to improve both occupant comfort and energy efficiency. So that's kind of the general framework. I see some Subtask leaders nodding, so that's a good sign. And internally within Subtask 4, we had a poll regarding the topic of the seminar. And we decided to take kind of an unusual way and to put the focus on some of the so-called horror stories from case studies. Because sometimes reality on the field is a little bit different from what researchers expected for many sorts of reasons. And we believe that by talking about this possible mismatch, we can actually learn how to be better at case studies, how to be better at designing building controls for research, but also for application in the industry. And Connor and I have been asked to moderate the seminar because we are responsible for a cross-subtask activity that's called C7 between subtask 1 and 4. That's looking kind of at the human dimensions of occupant-centric controls. And at the moment, we are working a lot with the stories, collecting anecdotes on precisely this mismatch between researchers' expectations and the reality of case studies. So that's why it's our faces that you see here. So to discuss these topics, we have a number of great panelists with us today, and thanks a lot for being here with us. They come both from the industry and from academia, and it's safe to say that those that come from industry, they have also tight links with academia. So I will provide a very brief introduction to each of them, basically just their name and their title, but you have received a flyer attached to this invite, and that provides more details about what they are working with. But obviously, as we go along in the debate, you'll get a chance to hear a lot about the projects they are working on. And as we will not show any slides, you will be able to see their faces on your screen. Feel free to pin them if you don't want them to disappear. I would just like to know if June is here with us yet. I am not sure I see him in the list, but hopefully he will be joining soon. He said that he would be with us shortly. So we will have June Young-Park, which is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. Then we have Babette Peulicke, who is an energy anthropologist at the Danish Technological Institutes. We have Isabella Gaetani, who's a senior scientist at Arup. We have Magdalena Baborska-Narożny, who's an associate professor at Wroclaw University of Science and Technology in Poland. We have Runa Hellwig, who is a professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. We have Giorgia Spigliantini, a research and innovation project manager at Runa Consulting, and previously a PhD student also. And Peulicke G, who is an assistant professor at Virginia Tech. So this is our panel. Lots of different competences and topics on a wide array of topics. So the way this is going to work is that if you have any questions during the panel debate, feel free to write them in the chat. And in the last part of the seminar, we will try to address most of your questions. And I suggest we get started. You go, Connor.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks to all our panelists for coming. It's very exciting to have such a diverse group here. So we're going to ask a couple of questions, and we'll kind of direct them at each of the panelists. And so the first kind of subject we're tackling is occupant-centric building design and operation. What is it and what is it not? So we'll direct this first question at Runa, if you will. And so the question is, in your opinion, what is occupant-centric building design and operation? And you can choose to answer it just as a definition, or maybe you want to talk about an optimistic example where technology was designed with the occupant in mind.
Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity to answer this question. It's, of course, a question which normally requires not a very short answer, so I try to pick some of the very main points. Occupant-centric control or design of building and operation of buildings has in its nature in the name that it should be have the occupant in the center. So we should actually know quite a bit about the occupants, and one could say put ourselves as planners or researchers in the shoes of the occupants, and seeing the occupants as laypersons, being confronted with a certain technology they sometimes know already, but when we implement new technologies, they may not know yet. And I think there is certain factors we should take into consideration, and this is what is the context the building is built in, what is the building used for, what is the setting in the social environment these occupant-centric control options are going to be operated in. And then, of course, also the question, what is local constraints, the outside conditions around the building. And here we have quite a number of influencing factors to be considered. And in many buildings, the challenge is, of course, that we do not know so much about the occupants. So this sounds almost like a task one cannot solve, but of course we know about certain cultures in certain regions. We know what occupants are used to, what is common technologies used so far in buildings, and can we build on those technologies already available. And then we need to look in the future, how is the building to be operated in the future? What is the challenges in the future? For instance, climate change, increasing urbanization, or probably also new technologies. So, for instance, is the technology I'm going to introduce now operable also in the future? Does it contribute in the future context? You were asking about a positive example. It's a bit of a provocative example, but this might accelerate the discussion, enhance the discussion. So I would like to propose that a good occupant-centric operation strategy could be that I refer now to a setting like an office building, for instance, where we have rooms in the building which are probably not in the responsibility and access to just one person, so a variety of persons, corridors, so or a larger office space. We could use occupant-centric design to switch off things, and then the occupants have the opportunity to switch on in their private spaces by themselves, and we can use sensors, presence sensors, in order to detect what people are currently passing, for instance, through a corridor. It sounds very simple, but reality shows contradictory examples, and I think this is exactly the collection done in the Cross-Task 7 activity on these about these horror stories. And that's, I think, if we start thinking about do people forget to switch off something, and can those technologies help us as people to, to do this task of switching off things we are not using anymore. I think that could be a great step forward and still leave the option to take yourself action when you're in a space and give yourself as an occupant control to adjust to what you need at the moment.
Awesome. Yeah, so you mentioned in the beginning, it's a very kind of multi-dimensional problem. You need to understand what the occupants need, what the occupants want, and then you want to build the technology to kind of design it for what's needed now, what's needed in the future, depending on the building. So yeah, it's of course quite difficult. And the example, was very kind of simple. Maybe it's still not done right as is. So that's great. Thank you. So we had June join us. So maybe June, I'll put you right on the hot seat and direct the next question at you, or actually the same question. So we're asking about occupant-centric design and operation. And rather than redefining it, because I think that was done nicely, maybe you can just give another example of an optimistic example where technology was designed with the occupant in mind.
Sorry, I just woke up. So are you asking me about the what is occupant-centric design and what is the optimistic example of it?
So maybe let's just do an optimistic example, because
So like, I think the optimistic example I would say is my own example before, which is Lightler. And then like the reason is I think based on my review, like many of OCCs are try not to include the occupant behavior centric, more on occupancy centric. I'm not saying occupancy centric is bad or negative, but I'm just saying more studies move toward the occupant behavior centric, which means we need to use more on interaction data of occupant and the system. For example, how like occupant use the light switches or thermostat, and that interaction should be something we're using the existing infrastructure or existing control system, not adding a new complexity on the building control systems. So try to be minimal and then use or try to maximize the interactive behavior between the building and occupant is the key in the OCC design, I think.
Great. Thank you so much for this definition. Yeah, definitely. I can hear from both your examples that simplicity of what the automation should be able to do is actually an important feature, and we'll definitely touch that later on in this discussion. Maybe another way of defining occupant-centric building design and controls is to look at counterexamples or horror stories, which is the topic of this seminar. And so maybe we would like to hear from some of you what is not occupant-centric. Can you give some examples that maybe reflect some building design or operation that was definitely not occupant-centric or not designed with occupant in mind? I'm thinking maybe Magdalena, you could comment on this, or if you have some anecdotes or stories from your own research, very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. First, I would like to stress that there are major differences in how occupant-centric design works for domestic and non-domestic contexts, and none of those are homogeneous. Most of my fieldwork focus on housing, and if you allow, I would like to concentrate on housing in my response. So heterogeneity of that I have in mind within housing starts with the varied connection between the future residents and their home design stage. In some cases, future residents are fully immersed in the design, understanding the purpose of specific solutions. However, in most cases, they are totally disconnected. As I observed in my research, the latter scenario may result in the residents being unaware of energy-saving systems and their interfaces intended by the designers to provide them with some degree of control over internal environment. Overly complex technology, as you have already mentioned, is a well-documented issue for housing operation. But even simple technologies, if obfuscated with unclear purpose and functioning according to a one-fits-all scenario, can fail. I documented a case study in the UK where after 2 years of occupancy, 20% of residents claimed they did not have mechanical ventilation in their apartment, 20%, though a system was in place. And unfortunately, this did not occur together with a perfect use of the system. The system was designed to work continuously. However, the majority of residents either at the very beginning of their occupancy switched it off, putting substantial effort into finding how to do it because it was not intended, so it was quite well hidden by the designer, but they managed to switch it off, or they use it only when showering, or they thought the cooker hood was the ventilation. So when they wanted some ventilation, they used the cooker hood. And the system was really simple. But things on the supply chain during the construction, plus residents coming, as Professor Hellwig mentioned, the previous experiences of residents play a key role in whether they will understand and the new technology or they wouldn't. And in this case, most of the residents came from naturally ventilated, drafty British homes. And here the mechanical system was new enough to be kind of ignored, switched off, and not used as designed. So the design intention was not to bother the occupants with the system working quietly in the background. However, the result was a major gap between the intention and the reality use.
That's definitely a great example that, well, I can recognize from my own research, and I think several people in this annex can recognize these kind of examples. So that's really relevant. Can I ask maybe Babette, if you have also some kind of examples of things that were not specifically occupant-centric, and I know you're an anthropologist, so you focus on how people experience the technology. Maybe you have a perspective on this?
Oh yes, I have plenty of horror stories. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be in the company of these great minds, so let's start out with that. I think the example I love to hate the most is from a daycare institution I was doing a project in. And I came in very late in the process to kind of evaluate. That's often what happens. They do a lot of things and then it doesn't work, and then on panic, we need to do something. Can you go and take a look at it? So I went there to do some interviews and observations, and they had completely renovated the entire place with heating system, ventilation systems, the envelope, everything. They really wanted to do like proper energy optimization of this building. And as everyone else, they also applied a lot of sensors, because sensors and data is the holy grail these days. So they put up these motion sensors, and we have seen motion sensors on the light with great effect in many different contexts. But in this case, it was a daycare institution. So I have this golden quote from one of the staff members in this institution, where she said that the kids could no longer get their nap time, because when they moved, then the light would turn on again. And that's just like, it's the problem, like it's the essence, right? You didn't really think about, okay, is there behavior and a need in this building here that we need to be aware of? It's more like, oh, this technology is super nice, this gadget is cool, let's just put it up everywhere and then we will save some energy. And now the kids couldn't have their nap. So I think there's so many of those examples where you just forget the context and then get a bit blindsided by the technology itself. That's
a great example. I hope it doesn't happen to many places. But
poor kids.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I think maybe we can move to the kind of next chapter of this discussion, which is about what is the status today and what is missing both. I mean, we have talked about a lot of issues, but maybe wrap them up and see what's missing both in real buildings but also in research practice. Maybe Connor, back to you.
Yeah, definitely. So now we kind of want to focus on what's the kind of state of things right now. So this question I'll direct to Georgia, and it's in relation to occupant-centric building design. Where is the industry now? And if you want to just answer that question, it's good. But if you want to also add if there's kind of a change of mindset, is usability becoming more of a priority? That would be great as well.
Thank you, Connor, and thank you for having me as well. So I'm in the industry only for a few months. And actually, I'm not kind of an industry which is, let's say, which deals with the design of products. So I kind of see it from the design and operation phase, let's say. So we use some products, but we do not design them. And in particular, I'm working in a research team. So I'm actually looking at, let's say, efforts of innovation in this field rather than state of the art somehow. But for what I see is that for what I see from the projects that I had to deal with is that in general there is this common sense that the more automation, the more occupant-centric control. And something that somehow as researcher and within this annex, I think that we all agree that this is not kind of true. But I think that this is something that is seen a lot still also in the design area. So by professional designer who actually have to promote their innovative design, and most often the innovative designs consist in more automation. So I also see actually kind of a revolution in this sector. And I think that we can see it also looking at upcoming calls for Horizon Europe projects and other innovation financed projects, is that actually maybe also following some European directives like the one from 2018, there is the will to actually include somehow the human in the loop, you know. So now a lot of these calls actually require training sessions with the users and somehow a co-design with the people. Also for very technological, let's say, interfaces. So I'm actually participating in one project who is addressed at designing energy dashboard for several kind of buildings, and there is actually a co-designing effort. So we are actually doing some workshop with different case studies with different people in order to build personas and try to design this technological system to be more, let's say, tailored to the necessity of people. Of course, it's a very long road, but I can say that I think that the problem is now seen from, at least from the people who look at innovation in this field. So kind of there is a hope in these efforts that we are doing also in this annex, I think.
That's a very optimistic and cool example. Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll also direct this at Isabella. Maybe if you can give us kind of an example of a change of mindset, or just your sense of, again, where the industry is now when it comes to this idea of building buildings kind of for people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Connor, and thank you for the opportunity. So I think, in my experience, I actually saw quite different cases in respect to what Georgia was mentioning. So I'm working out of the Smart Buildings team in the Arup London office, of course from home, but still in London. Well, and actually what we see, we do work a lot with this very big technology company, which you can't name, but on their offices. And there is really a return to giving occupants control. So nobody wants to have, the sealed windows kind of thing. That's only okay for the ground floor for security reasons, but really like manual windows, for example, are preferred throughout. And then it's very interesting because also it's up to us to kind of quantify the effect of user engagement if they get their people to use, for example, in this case, the windows accordingly to the building concept. So I think, there is quite a lot for us, for us in terms of like occupant specialists in some ways to do, because really like companies are interested in giving people control, having super happy employees, kind of having a productive and creative and stimulating office environment, especially now that has become a little bit of a question whether people will want to return to office at all, for example. So I think in that sense, there is a bit of a switch of mindset. We do I'm talking from my Arup experience, so I don't know whether this is common practice and I don't know how the others do it. But in our case, the very first thing we do with any client that asks for any kind of smart building consulting from us is really to develop user journeys. So, and this is, like the typical kind of a day in the life of. But so, for example, I thought it was so interesting what Babette was telling earlier about this kind of napping station thing, because there it means that nobody did that, right? Like nobody actually thought who were the users and what is a life of, a Sam who is 5-year-old and sleeps there. That wasn't done. So I think this is really very important. And what we normally do is you set out kind of a series of pain points. So what is not going amazingly in today's experience, and what are the things that technology can really help with? And in some cases we were like, oh, actually, for this particular user, everything is going great. We don't need to do any smart building intervention. So I think in this case, there is really a little bit of a will, at least to bring back people. What I also notice, which is at times rather scary, is that this will of including people can be really taken to the excess. So we have a lot of clients just calling in and saying, we heard smart buildings is super cool and we want to do it. And we want to have, like smartphone, everything and so on. And then the other day, somebody was saying, we envision to have a nudge coming on your smartphone whenever the plants need watering on the ground that you're in at the moment. And I was like, guys, this is just going completely out of control. So I think, it's almost interestingly enough like a client demand to the more technology, the better. But I see within our company, there is very much the will to do kind of a rational and really user-centric approach. So, mixed feelings. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot. That's a really interesting perspective. And it's also good to hear about, the solutions that are working, doing user journeys and personas and co-design from both of you, Jordan and Isabella. So a good talk, and also, partially optimistic state of the art. Magdalena, you would like to add something shortly?
Yes, just very shortly to underline the difference with the domestic sector, because with offices you can do this walk around and thinking what the users will do. In the domestic environment, the variety is just so great, it's impossible to foresee whatever the users will want.
Absolutely. I actually like on this point, maybe Magdalena, I'll share with you, this actually was more of a research project we did together with Cambridge. Kind of comparing how happy people were working from home in comparison to working from the office in terms of their sort of like environment. So like thermal, acoustic, and so on and so on. And obviously everyone was super happy with their environment at home. So I was really thinking, at the end of the day, occupant-centric design is giving people home in the office, like managing to recreate something that allows them to feel, to feel comfortable, to feel catered for in the office as well. But yes, not quite easy as it sounds.
Really interesting perspective, definitely. Maybe Philip, we haven't heard from you yet, and that's a shame. Could you also comment on this? I mean, we have heard from the industry, maybe from a research perspective, or even from the industry perspective, if you have some good ideas about this. Like what is missing maybe in the way conventional building technology is implemented and maybe a bit about what is your work focusing on improving in that sphere of user-centrism.
Sure. No, thanks for the opportunity and great to be with you all today. So I ride the roller coaster of being an optimist and then spending lots of time in the field. And then we fundamentally should be designing buildings for people. And then when I think about all of the potential solutions we have out there, I see that we also have significant applied problems in our industry, right? So when I mean by applied problems, I was at a brand new residential building last week that was meant to be very energy efficient, and I tested the ductwork, and 40% of the air that was supposed to be going through the duct system was leaking outside of the building. So as much as I'm an interface design and human-centered design nerd, when 40% of the air is leaking out of the ducts as was designed, these are very applied problems. So I love the human-centered design work, but I think we still have a lot of applied challenges in our industry that are going to be fundamental to fixing as a foundation before we can kind of take the next step. But I think at the same time, we've been here before in other industries, so we can look to other industries to like aerospace or the automotive industry to see how those industries have adapted as we've added more automation to systems and how to kind of design for people. And the last comment I'll make is, one of the most important words that's kind of transcended to a lot of the participants is context, right? And I think that anybody that's planning on embarking on designing for people, the context matters, right? Who are the people? What type of building is it? Is it residential? Is it a daycare, right? A daycare building is fundamentally different than a restaurant and the types of experiences that people expect. But let's not lose sight of the fundamentals too before we start designing for people, because it'll make our impact much better.
Absolutely, and thanks for adding that it's not obviously only the user-centric parts that can go wrong. It's a lot of practical problems, a lot of faults and the mismatches and so on. So definitely, and that's one of the main things that Subtask 4 is also focusing on. Maybe Runa, do you want to add something?
Yes, thank you. As we have the question, what is maybe missing or what is the status today, what can be observed and practiced, is that there is a mismatch very often between the planning and the implementation and real operation. And parts of it is probably that operation is not planned degree it should probably be planned. Also in connection to the technology going to be implemented into the building. And then reality in buildings is, of course, that especially in office buildings, there's reorganization of space all the time. And suddenly there is no ventilation anymore in a central corridor space where people also meet, or there is the information on how to use certain innovative light switches, for instance, which can be used to switch off after they switch on automatically based on a motion sensor, or it can be used for dimming the light. People don't know this. So all this knowledge kind of gets lost. And when you start as a new employee, you don't receive an introduction. And suddenly the building is operated in a very different way, or there's a power outage or a crash down of the computer system, and suddenly all the documented schedules currently in the BMS system gets lost. And I think what we plan should also be able to be operated later. And there is actually, I see a large gap in the follow-up on this. And I see actually that Clarice is raising hand, which reminds me that we have discussed this topic in a recent contribution to a book. yeah, maybe there's an opportunity to also talk about this, how building information systems can actually support such processes. Thank you.
Great one, thanks. Maybe Clarice, can I ask you to write your question in the chat so that we keep this time for discussing with the speakers, and then we'll take your questions afterwards if you don't mind. And maybe Babette, I'm going to let you answer to the next question because I think it's for you, but also keep your remarks maybe somewhere and we can touch it later, just so that we get to touch a bit all the topics, and at the end we can have a more open and free discussion on whatever we haven't covered. Thank you so much.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm not sure if we've mentioned that to kind of the audience yet, but we will have a question and answer at the end. So if you want to kind of preload your questions into chat, and then we'll kind of get to them after this panel discussion. So Babette, you had your hand up, but the next question we were gonna put your way anyway, so maybe you could do that instead. So this we're kind of calling a couple of questions we have called hot topics in human-centric controls. And so this one, so given we've seen many examples where control is taken away from people kind of for the sake of energy, can good design create the right balance between energy and people's control over the indoor environment? And maybe to be a little more provocative about it, are those two things even opposed in the first place?
I think, first of all, I think that you call it a hot topic is actually pretty much what I would like to say is the problem with this occupant-centric focus. It is like a hot topic. It's like something you can market your product on, and it's like it's a trend, and everyone wants to be like user engaging. But it's still on this very like pro forma level. Like Isabella said, then they have people approaching, being like, "We just want to make this super smart building." Okay, but why? What's the purpose? Like no one's talking about the actual purpose. It's more like, we want an app. Why? What do you want the app for? We want a dashboard. We want to visualize data. Okay, what data and why and to who and what do you want them to do with it? It's like, I think that we're kind of surfing on the last part of the wave where, this sensor data thing where it's just like the party is going on for the last 5 years and everyone's buying sensors and collecting data and making smart solutions. And now we're getting to the phase where we're starting to be a bit hungover, all of us looking at it and like, okay, what did we actually achieve here? And I think a lot of us thought that, okay, these solutions are going to be the quick fix, right? It has always been problematic to do these building regulations and all this stuff. And, yes, the sensors came, now we can quick fix it. But actually, it's the other way around. It's even more sensitive with sensors and data and smart solutions, because now you actually get input from the users and they will respond to it, because now it gets like super sensitive all of a sudden. And I think that's why, getting back to the topic of control, I think that's very important, and not necessarily control, but perceived control is also control. Like when you use Google Maps and you tap in, I want to go to this address, then you get 3 options and one will be highlighted. You feel like you have control because you can choose another direction, but you will 99% of the time you will go with the one that Google suggested. But you feel that you are in control, and that will increase your happiness with the outcome of it, compared to if you only just had one, like this is the way you should go now. Okay, I'm not sure. Why do you have to decide that for me? And I think that's what I'm trying to do with user-centric building design. I'm on a project right now where we're trying to kind of turn it upside down a bit. I don't know if this is just like a Danish thing, but we have this really negative way of seeing it, where we say, okay, 10% of people in a building will always be dissatisfied. And that's just, it's like, okay, 10% will not think this is okay. And apparently that's, okay, we are satisfied with that. I think you wouldn't do that in any other industry. You wouldn't be happy with your customers being 10% of them being dissatisfied. It's like giving up. So I wanted to turn it around, because we know that people have different indoor climate preferences. And we also know that buildings, there's physics to buildings, right? There will be some part facing north, some will be facing south, there will be the sun. So you actually have different indoor climate zones in a building. So why do we insist on cooling in one end and heating in the other and making the exact same level on all levels when we know that people don't even want the same to begin with? So I'm trying to see if I can give people the control back by moving to the indoor climate zone that they prefer, because then it's their own choice. I know for myself, being in an office building and you're sitting on your desk and it's too cold or too warm, and it's just like, oh, the building management people, they suck. It's just, it's their fault. Complaining, right? But if I chose myself to sit there, then I can move somewhere else. It's my responsibility. I kind of get a say in it, and that's giving control back without having to give everyone this individual possibility of, okay, I want it to be hotter here and my coworker next to me wanted to be colder. That was a very long, all over the place answer, but
no, that's a very good perspective, and yeah, I guess that's this question of if they're even opposed, or can we come up with other solutions that allow for both. Maybe June, you also would want to weigh in on this question. I know you've worked on stuff that you really are trying to kind of give people a lot of control while still optimizing for energy. So maybe you have some thoughts there.
Yeah, so I think, so here is my challenge while I'm testing that human-centric aspects, with my OCC. So that we actually need to establish good metric to evaluate that human interaction or human-centric parts, because the human-centric part is really subjective and hard to measure. And I noticed that the metrics that we evaluate how much they engage or how much they interact with the system and how they are happy. And these are not really justified or having any consensus among different researchers. So one example to evaluate, and this metric can be really subjective, and but my point is, we always argue that we are trying to improve the human comfort while reducing energy consumption. And energy consumption is easy to measure by metering data or some sort of the sensors. And the human comfort is somehow, but it's not easy as energy consumption, but it's relatively easier than human-centric perspective. Human interaction perspective. The human interaction perspective, that part is really, I am not sure what to measure. So, but I should ask some knowledge from the social scientists or behavior scientists about their perspective, and also the building scientists' perspective as well.
That's a very important part. The point of the metrics. How do we measure? Can we even integrate some of these things into control algorithms? And we're planning to touch that a bit later. I see some hands raised. I would like to ask Isabella maybe, because I know that you have to leave in 15 minutes and we would like to hear you again. But and then we can take George and Runa. About this topic of what do occupants want in terms of smart features? Like you are working in smart buildings. We have heard what the building owners would like to implement. Do you have any feedback or any knowledge or insights onto what features do people living in those buildings actually like in automated controls? Also, how far are they willing to go with automation? Are they willing to go all the way and let the automation control their indoor climate or other features? Or would they prefer to keep some kind of control? To what extent? How do we do it? Any insights are welcome.
Thank you very much, Lucile, for your question. So I think here is a little bit of the comfort report kind of. If I asked people what they wanted, they would have told me faster horses, right? So when you ask people which kind of smart feature do you want, they'll tell you, I want to see if there is parking space close to the office, or I want to see if there is a charging station for my e-bike, or I want to have the smart lockers, obviously people are interested in whatever makes their life easier, right? And then of course, maybe they don't want to switch off the lights when they leave, but basically what people want is to be happy and productive and comfortable in like wherever they are, right? In whatever their built environment is. Nobody's ever going to tell you, like, I want the feature that it saves a lot of energy, you know? So at least, you know, the people that we deal with. So I think there it's a little bit more about kind of ingraining. I still have to laugh about the fact that I said actually Tom Ford instead of Harry Ford, sorry. We have to ingrain the fact that they can really contribute to the overall concept of energy concept of your building, and how really they can contribute, like how effective the contribution can be, or, you know, whatever action they do, what is really the weight of their action. I think, I don't know, I believe very much in the fact that people will do whatever is convenient for them. And I agree when Babette says, you know, we need to have induction for people. And the first day of work, for example, we tell them about fire safety. We don't tell them anything about the energy concept. And this is true for the time being. But ideally, I feel that the whole thing should be so sort of ingrained and so obvious that people will want to do the right thing without even actually knowing it, if you like, in a certain way. So I think convenience, you know, if we manage to somehow work alongside with convenience, that would be very, very good. And in terms of what they want, I think they'll want easy things. But yeah, not necessarily, you know, they will not want to save the world when they go to work. They want to park their bike or whatever. But also, what is it that I want to say again? I think for us, you know, as smart buildings, it's very important to sort of expose the data, right? So when you say, you know, everybody complains about the dashboards, and it's true, right? Everybody's like, oh, the dashboards, they look so ugly, and who are they for, and so on and so on. But actually, even the fact that we can build these dashboards now, I think it's a major achievement. And the fact that we can really connect our buildings, and I don't know, we have clients with offices all over the world, and they can look at a screen and see each single office and compare it among all of their portfolio and see, you know, like this we have to refurbish, or this we have to do something about. Like, I think the fact that this data is there and somehow is visible is absolutely incredible, I think. And now, you know, it's all relatively recent. So it's fair enough that it's not perfectly visualized yet, and that we haven't yet differentiated what the FM should be seeing as opposed to what the occupants will be seeing, as opposed to the designer of your next building will be seeing. I think this is all, you know, sort of the work in progress. And I believe, as a very last point, the fact that, you know, we are typically, let's say, Arup is a building engineering and design company, right? And we deliver buildings. Very, very, very often, we don't see what happens to these buildings after. And so I think the whole sort of topic of soft landings is a major opportunity. And really the fact, you know, if we would manage to establish this kind of feedback between really like what people think within the offices or the buildings that we design and our next design project, that would be absolutely amazing. And I think really data has a very, very, very relevant role to play, and not in terms of, you know, post-occupancy evaluation or something, but real data. Like if you can excite people by showing them, you know, this is what you're contributing to, and this is how the building is behaving, and so on, almost as if it was a more organic thing, because at the end of the day, it is, right? I think that would be very powerful. Yeah. I'm not sure whether I answered at all, but there you go.
I mean, that topic of, I guess, post-occupancy evaluations and getting feedback from buildings in use, both maybe from questionnaires and so on, but also from the data, as you mentioned, for the next building project, and informing the process and improving little by little. That's definitely super interesting.
Yeah, and this is today, you know, at least not existent, like at least from what I can tell you, you know, this is, and often we think, this is great and this is how we should do it, and it's true, but then, you know, these building projects, they last, I don't know, years and years and years and years, and then there are so many stakeholders involved, and so it's just very easy to lose the thread a little bit. So I think almost there should be kind of another role, like another specialist that all it does following really the building life cycle and coming back.
Yeah, and I remember we had this discussion at the previous Annex 79 panel where you were also part of it. It's a never-ending question. Thank you so much for your participation, and sorry that you have to run off at some point. You're free to intervene in the next 9 minutes before you go.
Thank you, everybody.
I think Runa still has a hand up.
Yes, thank you, Lucy. Yeah, while we had the discussion running, I thought maybe it's necessary to point out again why actually do we want to have control, and what is a high perceived control. I mean, to have an interface to interact with the building is not a purpose as such. We do not aim to interact. We just want to use a space to do a proper work, to just live there. And nobody is intending to interact. This is actually something, this is not what we want to do in the first place. But we want to have the safe feeling that when there is something popping up, disturbing us, and we know how to tackle this because it comes from the building. When it gets too warm, we want to maybe open the window, or maybe we adjust the temperature. And this is a safe feeling. It's an option we would like to have. And when we get this option, we relax and then actually get more tolerant also to wider temperature ranges, which is supportive for sustainable building operation. The legacy of many occupant-centric meant products is that they know what the occupant wants. And the problem is there are so many dynamic influencing factors. I had probably a bad meeting with my boss, and then I start freezing just because I feel psychologically bad at a certain moment, and the building has nothing to do with it. But maybe I'm so disappointed that I'm going to complain that it's too cold to the facility manager. The facility manager tackles this the next day, and then it's not relevant anymore. Or I've forgotten to go for lunch because I'm so busy now, I like getting freezing. It's not a problem of the building. So I think we should say goodbye to this idea that we can measure the conditions and then adjust the building operation in a way that it exactly meets the needs of every occupant. And therefore, we need these interaction opportunities. And here I see also misunderstandings in standards. When a standard, I just take the example of light, is stating that I need to have probably an illuminance level of 500 lux at the workplace, then the standard says not that I must use this level, that I can't work without it. It's just saying you must have this potential to get enough light at your workplace. Whether you use this potential as a user is up to you. And here I think we need to look into and check how things are done in real buildings, because it would save a lot of energy. And you had on the list, I think, the question how this is related to the energy performance gap and maybe also satisfaction gap. And a revision of what is done in many cases in practice, I think, is necessary, a critical revision. There's a huge potential in such technology, but I think the application is probably a bit in a different area than very optimistic and also excited engineers think of those technologies.
Thank you.
I had one thing. maybe we can take this at a later stage. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to hear Georgia, because you have your hand up, and then we should continue moving because we have a few more questions, and it would be nice to have time for the audience's questions as well. Go for it, Georgia.
Yeah, so to add in something to Runa's speech, I very much agree with her because, you know, of course, we have to seek for the satisfaction of people, but we should not forget that we also should try to change their behavior towards a more sustainable one. So the thing is to understand their needs, of course, but also to try to guide them. And in these terms, I think that we have a lot to understand from other fields, like user experience studies, more related to apps and all the informatics and website, etc. So there is somehow in other fields. Some techniques are used in terms of persuasive technology to understand what we should show to people to try to guide them towards a better or a certain behavior. I know that this is tricky because it's manipulation somehow, but looking at it in a good way, could be a way to change our vision because, of course, as engineers, as architects, we have a very building-rooted way of looking at things, but maybe the kind of information that people would like to see are not very related to building controls, but they could affect the way they interact with building controls. So somehow I think that there's a lot of room for us to study in this field. And this is very important because in my experience, I had some case studies during my PhD thesis in which occupants had really a huge control over their environment. They had a thermostat that they could control completely freely, but it was kind of so radiant panels, so it didn't respond like in a second, you know. So at the end, they were really frustrated and they really hated that space, which was designed actually to be more inclusive and occupant-centric, etc., etc. And it was they were classrooms for musicians. So the aim was to letting the singer and the pianist have their complete comfort in different situations and performing these different activities. So in its intention, it was really good. But in the end, what it lacked, in my opinion, was training, education, communication, somehow from someone just telling what they should do with these systems.
That's very interesting. Yeah, we've been hearing a lot of repeated themes here, so that's very interesting. Okay, so this last kind of hot topic we have, I'll direct towards Philip, and I've been seeing you nod along as well, so if you want to add to any of the previous answers, you can as well. But so as we develop and implement these occupant-centric control strategies, how can we make sure buildings are usable by all, regardless of their physical abilities, age, technical proficiency, etc.?
Yeah, so again, the context matters, right? And using the right tool to solve the right problem, you know, and also I think it's okay for us to recognize that we each have our own expertise and we have our own tools, right? And sometimes we don't have the right tool to solve the problem. So I guess that's a very abstract way of saying, I think we need to bring more people to the table that have different skills than traditional architecture, engineering, and you know, contractors, so to speak. And also be willing to admit, I mean, I could talk about days about failures and mistakes, right? But what we publish and what we present often are all the successes, right? So how about a conference or you know, a special issue in a journal about all the failures that we've had, because we absolutely will learn more about that. But specifically to how to design for different populations, I mean, this is a very diverse group. from all over the world. We all logged into Zoom. Nobody read an instruction manual, right? Most of us have figured this out with there are certain elements and features of the way that this technology was developed that's missing in the way that we design and implement technologies in buildings. And, you know, buildings are complex systems, and I'm not trying to say that, you know, Zoom is a one-off discrete interaction or software, but there are lessons of the way that people, you know, if you want to design for people, bring them into the process. I'm not saying that we need to make them design the entire building, but there are certain critical interactions or pieces of the building that you just won't understand without having the potential user of the space be available. Also, we talk a lot about occupants, but the operators get kind of lost a lot in this conversation. If folks aren't involving the people that are going to maintain the buildings in at least a design meeting, they're failing, right? And I, even in some of my applied industry work, I have to battle with design teams to just get a maintenance manager in the meeting. It's like they work for the same company, yet they don't view them as the same team, right? So designing for you know, physical, physiological, and psychological limitations of the user that you're that you're really working for. Bring the people that are going to operate the buildings into the mix. And if you're ever in a design meeting with somebody and say, well, I think, or from my perspective, you've already lost because you're not designing the building for that architect or that engineer, right? You know, really think about who the person is that you're serving in this role. And so, yeah, I threw a lot out. Know the tools that you're using to solve the right. Don't bring the chainsaw to when you need a scalpel for the particular problem.
Great image. Thank you so much, Philip. I can see a lot of hands up, but I'm thinking we only have half an hour left, and we can maybe keep all of this discussion to the very end, where we'll just open it up, if that's okay. I would just like to ask, well, let's start with Babette. Maybe you are not an academic. What would you suggest we do now? I mean, we have heard about a lot of different topics. We have heard about a lot of problems. We have heard about some solutions, but do you have like some good examples of good practice or things that you have seen that work that we should be working on? And if you have any advice to the 38 academics in this room that are working with developing such control strategies for future buildings, like what would be your key inspiration and key good examples, good practice?
Honestly, everything Philip just said, it was just like my go-to arguments that I really wanted to clap my hands. I think the biggest issue within this field is the lack of interdisciplinarity, like a huge thing. I've only been working in this field for 5 years, and it was the first thing I noticed, and it hasn't improved at all. There's more focus on, we need to focus on the users and all this, but when it gets done, even when people actually try to work interdisciplinarity, it often ends up being like parallel runs instead of actual working together team-wise. I've seen it so many times with the engineers doing their thing and the anthropologists doing their thing, and then you don't really get the result anyway. And I know from experience that when we actually work together, legitimately, genuinely working together, the results are so much better than when we do them in our different fields. It's completely insane. You can't even compare the two. I think we really need that, both with the nudging and like user experience. If we want to do a nice dashboard, then there are people who are educated in doing dashboards. Let's get them in. Then let's get some people in who know stuff about behavior and make that mix, because that's definitely what we need. And then I think we need to be way more flexible in the way that we see buildings. Obviously, you need to design to the occupants, but that group may change. So we need to be able to make dynamic buildings that can change with the user needs changing. And COVID is actually a really nice example of that. The project I was just talking about before, it's completely ironic to think about now, but 3 years ago when I wrote that application to get the funding, My goal was to squeeze as many people as possible in at as few square meters as possible. Completely insane to think of now, but energy efficiency and all that. And then COVID came, and now it's a completely different picture we are looking at. But the interesting thing is that we actually, I have a great case building with this. They are flexible, so it's insane to see that actually playing out. But they just went with it. So they went from having, it's like a consultancy place. They have free seating since their staff are often out with the customers. Then they got sent home during the lockdown, and now they are kind of back since they can't go to the customers. So it's a completely different setup. And before they had a lot of meeting rooms, for instance, and open offices and all that. But they realized, okay, we have to make online content now. We can't do physical courses and training and seminars and stuff. So they just shut down all these meeting rooms and then turned it into studios and podcast editing studios and movie editing studios and then teaching facilities, and completely went with the flow to what do the users actually need now. And it's working, and I can see like this way of seeing control, because when we talk about control, we often think it's something that I can push a button, or I can open a window, I can do something manually with a thermostat. But this idea of control is working the same way, and it's really efficient for the satisfaction of the users. This feeling of that you respond to the indoor climate based on your emotion, it's so true. But in this case building, it also contains that, because it has different zones. You can go to a more like lounge area where the lighting is different from the more like concentration, I need to write a report areas. There's like reading areas, different silence zones. There's everything. So you can always move yourself to a space that fits the need you have right at that specific moment, instead of having to wait. Okay, it's cold, I'm turning the thermostat up, and then I have to wait 30 minutes before anything happens. So yeah, flexibility and interdisciplinarity, I would say, is what we need.
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, so maybe we'll kind of pass it back to kind of more the research side too then. So let's say over to you, June. How do you think researchers can kind of, what advice do you have to people engaging in kind of case studies? That's a big thing that is happening over in ST4. And then given that some of your findings are a little maybe fuzzy, how do you think that this can kind of be used to actually create like generalizable findings and support the industry?
Yeah, so I think it is. I'm trying to continue my comments on the previous question about the experimental procedure of the OCC, and one like anecdotal evidence that we had in my like previous PhD studies. We installed a new device like called OCC or Lightner in the occupant's office, and then say, hey, please use as usual. But since we did something, they really cannot do as usual, 100% as usual before. But their like behavior is kind of try to like explore our device very much, and then see what's happening from the device. But that was not our expected. So, but it's the experimental procedure is very limited, because it's hard to like hire so many people and then do a real-time experiment, and especially due to COVID-19 situation these days. So one like kind of acknowledge we should make is whenever we do OCC experiment, because the name itself innate contains the occupant, so we need to consider their the kind of Hawthorne effect of and try to avoid the Hawthorne effect of when we applying the OCC in the experimental procedure. And that kind of experimental procedure, maybe we can use some simulation-based approach to test those, to avoid that kind of situation by like generating synthetic population of the occupants. and then try to see the generalized performance of it, not like a limited number of people. And in fact, the reviewed study indicates that many of OCC studies contain less than like 10 occupants, and the time-wise, it's within a month or max like 2 or 3 months. That's really short amount of time, never capture the seasonal variation and also the behavior variation by people. So in that sense, again, the simulation really works well, but with the more novelly developed the occupant behavior model again.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a limitation that should be tackled, and it's not an easy one. Let's maybe touch a topic that you have started to touch, June, a little bit. That's about how do we, so we have talked about a lot of different topics linked to making building controls more occupant-centric. And I think we have heard some of the solutions where to not focus too much on what you put on the automation, but what you do around it, how you teach people and so on. But are there maybe some things that we can measure that we can actually put in OCCs, as June mentioned before? Yeah, you said that it's a bit difficult to find the proper metrics to what are the things we can measure to make sure that occupants are actually taken into account. I don't know, maybe June, you have an idea about this. I was thinking maybe Magdalena, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this. What should be included in the control algorithms? Can we measure some occupant-based parameters, or should we just kind of work around this and have some kind of checklist of what should control strategies in themselves and not just the algorithms entail?
If I may come back to the previous question, because I just was thinking when Runa was telling about that people don't really want to, this is not the goal of engaging with the building. I was thinking about the sector of energy poverty, and with this notion of feeling safe when you think of having control. The energy poverty in housing is a huge area, and for example in Europe now, when we have spiking energy prices, this is probably a growing issue of a big issue of giving people control over their internal environment so that they can control prices. I know that, not prices, but the cost, the energy consumption. In Poland, this is a big problem that was even in press, that people, that there was a question for legal regulation for taking away control from inhabitants in multifamily settings, in buildings, where we call this seminar horror stories. So I can tell you about energy vampires in such settings, where people limit their energy consumption, hoping the neighbors will heat them. So this is a different frame to look at control, when your own control limits the possibility, the options that others have. If they want to stay warm, they have to heat you. So I know this is not answer to your question, but it's just to provide a different perspective on the problem of control that people may wish to have, but are not given, or should not be given fully. I don't know. There are others probably who want to talk, because I can talk for a long time.
No worries. I think maybe it's best if we stop here. We just take the audience's questions, if that's okay with you. I mean, at the end, we got to touch a lot of different topics in a lot of different areas, and we covered a lot of very varied topics. I hope it was not too confusing, but I thought it was very interesting for sure. But the word goes to you, Connor.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're seeing some questions roll in, and we want to give that time. I mean, we can talk with these panelists for a very long time, so we have to stop it somewhere. But thank you so much. That was great. So just before we kind of transfer over to the question and answer section, we're just going to do one kind of plug for an activity that Lucile and I are working on. So many of you in the annex kind of in this meeting have probably already heard us present on our activity of kind of collecting the stories, many of them similar to the ones we heard today. And so we're doing this kind of broad story collection, and then we have a nice team of researchers. Actually, some of the panelists are in this group to kind of assess those stories and bring some broad learnings from them. So in our last update, we're kind of finishing it off, but we're kind of reopening it. We're hoping there's maybe some renewed interest after this session. So we're looking for contributions kind of before February 4th. So Lucile is going to post a link in the chat for that. I think she just did that now. And yeah, you can go take a look at that. You can see the stories that are already there. And then if you have a story, it would be really, really helpful for you to contribute. Okay, so we can also jump into the questions. Now, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but Clarice, maybe you wanted to unmute yourself and you can ask the question. And yeah, you're there. Awesome.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I just put it in the chat as request, but I thought we talk a lot about occupant-centric design without considering the fact that the lifespan of the occupants within a building is far lower than the lifespan of the building itself. And if we are going to really work towards reducing emissions and saving the planet, shouldn't we consider this as a central aspect of our designs? That means, how does the occupant relate to the lifespan of the building controls and the building system? That's one question. How does the occupant relate to the lifespan of the building? And how do we see these things changing as tenancy changes? For example, we will change systems and controls every time we change the tenancy. We will change only controls when we change the tenancy. Will controls be robust to any tenancy? So what are the strategies to coordinate lifespans in a sustainable way? Because if we put aside the lifespan discussion and only say we are satisfying the immediate needs of the occupants, we are doing a disfavor because things change and we shouldn't be designing for the moment or the minute. So how do you view that?
Thank you, Clarice. And maybe I can just add a similar question from Catherine, who's asking, when occupants are changing and the tenants are changing in the building, how do we make sure that the OCCs, the controls themselves, are kind of understood and used in the same way across different occupant generation? I hope I was true to your question, Catherine. Yeah, maybe Babette, go for it.
Yeah, I think that was exactly my point, was saying that we need to be flexible and we need to, like the example with the meeting rooms being changed to these video editing, whatever, actually assessing the behavior and the need and then changing the rooms and the building for that. I think right now we have this way of thinking about it where you put up a building and then when you're done with that building process, it's just like, okay, that's it. And then we're going to leave it for 50 years and then job well done. I think we need to be more in a moment of reassessing, like constantly looking at it and say, okay, so how are we using this now and has the needs changed? And I think that's where data and sensors and machine learning actually can be really beneficial. We are working, I know everyone's working on that right now, so, but I think there's a potential in that. So it basically means that you just have to train the algorithm whenever you have a new set of tenants coming in, for instance, and that will be a process where you need to have more feedback from the users, but then the system will get to know these specific users and then they know them for that time that they're there until you have a huge change of occupants or tenants again. But I think there's a potential in data and sensors right there, actually.
Great. Runa?
Yeah, flexibility, a very good keyword. I think flexibility, how can we reach flexibility in buildings? When we plan buildings, they have a certain setting, ceiling height, distribution of spaces. And when we, for instance, plan for residential buildings, it's more difficult to later use it as an office building, but the other way around could, under certain circumstances, work. So I think actually there is a need to look in those topics and also related to the building service systems used in order to provide heating, maybe cooling, ventilation to those spaces. And it's probably the case that very simple concepts which do not use that much resources in the end tend to be more flexible, and with a good basic passive organization of the building, and where we do not squeeze everything out we can get. So where we consider also a bit more generous space organization, then we are probably more flexible. And I think this is an interesting point when it comes to life cycle assessment and impact discussion, that not always the lowest impact in the first construction might up into the lowest impact along the whole lifespan. So it's just an inspiration for further discussion, but I think this is so much related to building service systems, and then in the end also sensors. And another point is those new technologies, they change so fast. And here also the question is how many of those sensors and active actors we put into the building, how many do we really need? Because they will be changed in very few years anyway. And the more we put in, the more resources we waste. Thank you.
Thank you, Runa. Magdalena, you had a comment?
Yes, just a very short comment that in housing, again, the requirements for documenting every step of putting in a system, at least in Poland, are not as advanced as for bigger constructions. And a lot is being done and commissioned based on somebody's professional awareness, good knowledge, and all perfect. But the problem, huge problem, starts when the house is sold and goes on to the next user who doesn't have this inbuilt knowledge and is completely lost. And again, horror stories. I've spoken with a person who had an extremely complex, advanced, smart home that was sold, and he was hurried to go to this building a few years later and finding huge air conditioner outside. And the house was actually equipped with a heat pump that didn't require it. It could do the job, but the new owner somehow missed this opportunity and put in a lot of effort, energy, and so on, and cost. So it's a huge professional responsibility of documenting the European building logbook idea. It's a lot of effort, but I think in the long term, if we address the durability of systems and what is lost with the people changing within a specific context, I think it's worth it.
Another great horror story, thank you. There is another question in the chat about the lack of interdisciplinary approach in industry practice. And Yamsun Tao is asking, what are the bottlenecks? Do they require a transformative technology breakthrough, or do they require actions that are not technical, so policy changes, lack of which may be the reason why it has no progress in this process phase for decades? Pretty interesting question. Does anyone feel like answering that? Yeah, Georgia, go for it.
Yeah, I will answer only for my experience. For what I've seen for now, of course, there's a topic about policy, and another topic is the social awareness. Because, of course, in the private sector, you have to have a client who is willing to pay for something, which could be a service or a product. It depends, of course. But, think about sustainability. Only a few years ago, all the people knew that this concept existed, but there were no, let's say, push from a policy point of view so big to really make the industries having some goals in this direction, you know. So now every big firm has a sustainability plan, and also they are doing a lot of works in this direction, and everybody has also a different concept of sustainability a little bit. So I mean, I think that from an academic point of view, there still needs of nomenclature, of a common understanding of things, and a vocabulary that should be promoted, I think, from the research point of view, because I mean, then it's somehow integrated in the policy field, but it's something that the private sector will never do. The private sector arrives later, and the private sector is driven by this social awareness and also policy, of course. So there is a big need of talking with the stakeholders, public and private stakeholders, to promote these things. So this is how I see it, because now, just to finish, normally when doing, I mean, not a research project, this is something completely different, but in a, let's say, industrial project, as we call it in the company, normally you don't have budget to engage sociologists or behavior specialists and things like this. So in order to address these necessities, as a company, we participate to several research projects, financed research projects, in order to, you know, be on the edge of the changing world. But I think that at the end, in order to have these results in this industrial project, you really need to have an awareness from public and private stakeholders.
Definitely. Thank you, Babette. If you can, answer in 1 minute, and then we'll round off because the clock is ticking.
Yes,
But we would like to hear you.
I think we're experiencing a high interest in this interdisciplinarity, because I think a lot of people are now tired of bad experiences, of building buildings and installing all the new fancy stuff and, you know, doing all the best that is there with the technology, and it still never works. It never works. And everyone is just tired of that. So we have gotten to a point now where we don't ever sell just the engineering part. People always want the anthropology part as well, because they see it as kind of a, maybe not a guarantee, but it seems like it's then more plausible that it's going to work instead of just being focusing on the technology. So I think we are seeing a trend going that way.
And that is great to hear. Thanks for ending this on a very optimistic note. I think we are right on time. Connor, do you have anything to add, or should we just run it off?
Yeah, I think it's a good time to end, a good note, and just thanks again for all the panelists that came, and all the people that came to the session as well, all our audience participants. It's been really great.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed and got some maybe new perspectives. It's a kind of an unusual discussion for Subtask 4, and we thought that could be an interesting angle to look at. Thank you so much for your participation, both the panelists and the...
Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting us.